Eleanor Whitaker grabbed that man by the collar before he could finish his sentence. Her boots hit the porch hard. Her hands were covered in barn grease and dried blood from a fence wire that had cut her 3 hours ago. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The bank letter was still crumpled in her apron pocket, the one that said she had 30 days before they took everything her father ever built. And this stranger, this worn-down, quiet-eyed man, had just asked her if the job was still available. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The only job left on this ranch is husband. You want it or not?" If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every single part of Eleanor's story to the very end, because what happens next is going to shake you to your core. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why Eleanor said those words, you have to understand everything she had already survived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor Whitaker read it twice, standing in the middle of her kitchen with flour still on her hands, from the biscuits she hadn't finished making, and both times the words said the same thing. 30 days. Outstanding balance. Foreclosure proceedings will commence. She set the letter on the table. She picked up her biscuit dough. She finished making breakfast. That was Eleanor Whitaker. That was who she had always been. The world could hand her a disaster, and she would finish what she started before she allowed herself to feel it. But that night, after the lanterns burned low and the barn went quiet, she sat on her father's old chair on the front porch, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees, and she stayed very still for a very long time. The Montana sky was enormous above her. Stars everywhere. Cold coming down off the mountains early this year, earlier than it should have been, which meant a harder winter, which meant more feed, which meant more money she did not have. Her father, Robert Whitaker, had built this ranch from nothing. 200 acres of Montana frontier land that nobody wanted because the soil was too rocky and the winters were too brutal, and the nearest town was nearly 8 miles east. He had spent 30 years breaking that land, coaxing it into something that fed cattle and grew hay and kept a family alive. He had done it with his bare hands and a stubbornness that Eleanor had inherited completely. He died 2 years ago in the spring. A bad heart. Went quietly in his sleep, which people said was a blessing, but Eleanor had never quite forgiven him for leaving without warning. He left her the land. He left her 2 horses, a small cattle herd, an aging barn, and a mortgage she had not known existed. He also left her alone. Her mother had passed when Eleanor was 19. No brothers or sisters. No cousins nearby. No husband, because the men in Harlow County had made their opinions about Eleanor Whitaker very clear for most of her adult life. And those opinions had nothing to do with her character and everything to do with the size of her body. Eleanor was a large woman. She had always been a large woman. She stood 5'8" and carried nearly 300 pounds on her frame, and in 1885, in a small Montana frontier town, that was the only thing most people needed to know about her before they made up their minds. She had watched men look at her and look away. She had heard the whispers in the dry goods store, the laughter that stopped just a second too late when she walked past. She had sat in the church pew every Sunday and watched every woman around her get chosen, get courted, get married, get a life that looked like what a life was supposed to look like. And she had gone home every Sunday and fed her cattle and repaired her fences and told herself she did not need any of it. She had mostly believed it. What she could not deny was the ranch. The ranch needed her. The ranch had always needed her. From the time she was a girl following her father through the fields. Eleanor had understood the land the way some people understand music instinctively in her bones. She knew when a fence post was weakening before it showed visible damage. She knew which sections of pasture would flood in a heavy rain. She knew her cattle by sound, by movement, by the particular way each animal stood when something was wrong. Running this ranch alone for 2 years had nearly destroyed her body. Running it alone, while watching the debt grow, had nearly destroyed everything else. The barn roof had been the latest catastrophe. A violent August storm had done what 2 years of weather had been threatening to do. Collapsed the center beam on the east side, brought down a section of roof the size of a wagon, and left 40% of her stored hay exposed to the sky. Hay she had spent the entire summer cutting and baling. Hay that represented the difference between a herd that survived the winter and a herd she would have to sell off at terrible prices come November. She had climbed up there the morning after the storm with a hammer and a mouthful of nails and started working before the sun finished rising. 3 days into the repair, her hands were torn up. Her back screamed every time she straightened, and she had fixed perhaps a third of what needed fixing. She was 40 feet in the air on a damaged roof when Thomas Reed walked through her gate. She heard the gate creak. She looked down. She saw a man she did not recognize carrying a tool bag that had seen better decades, wearing a jacket with a tear along the left shoulder that someone had stitched closed with what looked like baling twine. How was not a young man. Somewhere past 40, with the kind of face that had spent most of its life outdoors. Weathered, lined, not unpleasant, but carrying a weight in the eyes that Eleanor recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. He stopped when he saw her up on the roof. He looked at the damaged section. He looked at the tools she had laid out on the ground below. He looked back up at her. "That center beam is cracked in 2 places you haven't reached yet," he said. "You fix the surface without addressing those cracks, the whole thing comes down again, first heavy snow." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "I know that," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I figured you did." He set his tool bag down on the ground. Not in a way that said he was making himself at home, more in a way that said his arm was tired. "I'm looking for work, any kind of work. I can see you've got plenty of it. I don't have money to pay anyone. I'm not asking for much. I'm not offering anything." He nodded. He picked his tool bag back up. He looked at the barn roof again, and Eleanor could see him calculating the same way she calculated automatically, involuntarily. Because some people looked at a broken thing and saw a problem, and other people looked at a broken thing and immediately started seeing the solution. "That third rafter on the left," he said, "the one that's bowing, that's going to go before the cracked beam does. If you're planning to work from right to left, you might want to reconsider." Eleanor stared at him. She came down off the roof, not because she was going to hire him. She came down because she wanted to look him in the eye when she told him to get off her property. And she had always believed that if you were going to say something hard to a person, you should at least have the decency to do it at eye level. She climbed down the ladder and walked toward him, and he did not step back when she approached, which she noticed because most people stepped back. Up close, she could see his right hand. The way it held the tool bag strap, not wrong exactly, but compensated. 3 fingers that didn't fully straighten. Old injury badly healed. The kind of damage that happened when a farming accident got treated too late or too poorly, which in this part of Montana in this era meant it had probably been treated with whiskey and improvised splints and a great deal of hoping for the best. "Thomas Reed," he said, and offered his left hand instead of his right. She shook it. "Eleanor Whitaker. This your land. Every inch of it. Your husband. No husband." He didn't react the way men usually reacted to that information, which was either with pity or with a particular type of interest that Eleanor had learned to be very wary of. He just nodded, like she had told him the weather. "How long have you been up on that roof?" he asked. 3 days. "Sleeping when?" "When I finish for the night." "Which is when?" "When I can't see anymore." He looked at her hands. Her palms were wrapped in strips of cloth that had gone from white to rust brown. Under the cloth she knew were blisters that had opened and reopened so many times in the past 3 days that they had stopped hurting and started simply being a fact of her hands. "You need someone who knows how to rebuild this barn," he said. "I need someone who works," Eleanor said, "not someone who feels sorry for me." "I don't feel sorry for you." His voice was even. "I'm observing that you have a damaged barn, approximately 2 weeks of good weather left before the fall rains start, and 1 pair of hands trying to do the work of 3. That's not pity, that's arithmetic." Eleanor crossed her arms. She looked at him for a long time. She had gotten very good at reading people living alone out here. You had to. When the only interactions you got were with the men at the feed store, the women at the Sunday service, the occasional traveling salesman, and the land bank officer who showed up once a quarter with bad news and a polite expression. You learned to read what people were actually saying underneath what they said out loud. What Thomas Reed was saying underneath his careful words was, I need this job as much as you need the help. Show me what you know about that beam, she said. He showed her. For the next 2 hours, he walked her through the structural damage with a precision that surprised her. He knew timber. He knew the particular way Montana pine behaved under seasonal stress, how it expanded and contracted where it was likely to fail and where it was likely to hold. He talked about the roof not as a collection of broken pieces, but as a system, an interconnected structure where each element affected every other, and fixing one thing without understanding its relationship to the whole was how you ended up doing the same repair twice. Eleanor had known most of what he told her, but he knew some things she didn't. She hated admitting that. She admitted it anyway because she was her father's daughter, and Robert Whitaker had always said that the most expensive thing a person could do was let pride stop them from learning. "I can't pay you in money," she said when he finished. "What can you pay me? Meals, a place to sleep. That's it. And I don't know for how long." Howe was quiet for a moment. She expected him to decline. She had framed it as a decline really offered terms so poor that any man with options would walk away. "I'll need to know where I'm sleeping before dark," he said. That was not a decline. Eleanor showed him the small storage room off the back of the house that had a narrow cot and a window that let in the morning light. It smelled like dust and old harness leather. He set his tool bag down next to the cot and looked around the room with an expression that told her this was better than what he'd had before. That night, Eleanor made supper and put a plate on the table without making it a conversation, and Thomas sat down and ate without making it more than it was. They were not comfortable with each other. They were simply two people in the same room, which was more than Eleanor had had in longer than she wanted to count. She was clearing the dishes when she heard him say quietly, "It was a threshing machine, the hand." She turned. Howe was looking at the table. 6 years ago. The machine kicked wrong and I wasn't fast enough. Took 2 fingers entirely and mangled these 3. He flexed his right hand slightly. Most ranch owners take one look and decide I'm not worth what they'd have to pay a whole man. Eleanor set the dish in her hand down slowly. "How many ranches have you worked since?" she asked. 11, none longer than 3 weeks. He looked up. "They hire me when they're desperate and let me go when they realize I can't do everything they need." "What can you do?" "Construction, repair, planning. Anything where the work is in the mind more than the grip." A pause. "And I'm left-handed by nature, so the injury cost me less than it would have cost most." Eleanor sat back down at the table. "Why'd you come to this ranch?" she asked. "There's bigger operations north of here, better paying work if you can get it." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw your fence line coming in," he said. "The way it was repaired. 17 different techniques, all of them, right? None of them matching because you were using whatever material you had available at the time." He looked at her. "That's not someone who doesn't know what they're doing. That's someone doing it alone. I thought a person doing that alone might judge me on what I can do instead of what I can't." Eleanor was very still. She had not expected that. She picked up the dish she'd set down and took it to the wash basin and stood there for a moment with her back to him, getting herself together, because what he had just said had landed somewhere that wasn't defended well, and she needed a second to rebuild the wall. "We start before dawn," she said. "I'll have coffee ready at 5. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't discomfort. She had slept through worse conditions than a man in the storage room. It was something she couldn't name at first, lying in the dark, listening to the Montana wind move through the grass outside her window. Then she named it. It was the fact that for the first time in 2 years, when she went through the mental list of everything that needed doing on this ranch, the weight of it felt slightly less absolute. Not because anything had changed. Not because the roof was fixed or the debt was paid or the weather was going to hold. But because there were 2 people now who knew the problem. She turned that over for a while, and then she made herself stop thinking about it, and she went to sleep. Thomas was up before the coffee was ready. She found him in the barn at 4:45, with a lantern examining the beam he had identified the night before, making notes on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil. He didn't hear her come in. She watched him for a moment, the way he moved around the damage systematically, the way he noted each problem in sequence, rather than jumping to conclusions, the way his left hand was already reaching for solutions before his mind had finished documenting the problem. He was good at this. That was the honest truth. And Eleanor Whitaker had not survived 2 years alone on a struggling Montana ranch by refusing to see honest truths. "You figured out the beam situation?" she asked. He turned. Not startled he had heard her after all, just didn't make a production of it. 3 points of failure instead of 2. But there's a way to reinforce it without pulling the whole frame. It'll take a week, maybe 10 days, but the repair will hold better than the original construction. "Show me." He showed her. They worked side by side that first day without talking much, which suited Eleanor fine. She had never been a woman who needed conversation to fill silence. She communicated through action. "Hand her the next board. Hold this here, tell me when it's level." And Thomas understood that language without her having to explain it. By midday, they had addressed 2 of the 3 failure points. By late afternoon, Eleanor was moving through the work faster than she had in 3 days alone. She did not comment on it, but she noticed. It was on the 4th day that the trouble started. She had driven the wagon into Harlow to pick up the timber. Thomas said they needed long cuts of pine that she could not mill herself, the one piece of the repair that required outside material. She pulled up to Caldwell's Supply, which was the only lumber supplier within 20 miles, and got down from the wagon and walked into the store. Margaret Caldwell was behind the counter. Margaret Caldwell was always behind the counter. She was a narrow-shouldered woman of about 50, with the posture of someone who had never once doubted her own importance, and she had been a particular source of misery in Eleanor's life for as long as Eleanor could remember. Margaret's family had money. Old money, frontier money. The kind that came from being one of the first people to arrive in a new territory and having the ruthlessness to hold on. She owned the supply store, held partial interest in the grain elevator, and Eleanor now knew from the bank letter had purchased the outstanding note on the Whitaker ranch debt 3 months ago. "Eleanor," Margaret said in the tone she always used, which managed to be civil and contemptuous at the same time. "Margaret, I need long pine cuts. Here's the list." Eleanor set the paper on the counter. Margaret looked at the list without touching it. "I heard you've taken on a hired man." "I've got someone helping with the barn repair." "Where'd you find him?" "He found me." Margaret's mouth curved in a way that had nothing to do with smiling. "A man with no references showing up at a single woman's property. I do hope you've been careful, Eleanor. A woman in your position can't afford to be naive." "I'm not naive about much of anything, Margaret. Can you fill that order?" "I can. Whether I will is another matter." Margaret finally picked up the list. "There's the question of your outstanding account here." "I've been current on my account." "Current, yes. But your credit is stretched, and given that the banknote is well." Margaret set the list down again and folded her hands on the counter. "I'm going to need full payment on delivery, no more credit." Eleanor looked at her. She knew what this was. She had known Margaret Caldwell long enough to recognize this particular move, the tightening of the vise at the moment when the pressure would hurt most. Margaret knew about the barn damage. Margaret knew about the 30-day foreclosure notice. Margaret knew everything that happened in Harlow County because Margaret Caldwell had spent 30 years making herself the person that information flowed through. "Full payment on delivery," Eleanor repeated. "I'm afraid so." Eleanor had exactly $42 in paper money in her coat pocket. The timber order at market price was going to run somewhere between $70 and $90 depending on the cuts. She did not show Margaret Caldwell, the calculation happening behind her eyes. "I'll be back by end of week," she said. She walked out of the store. She got back on the wagon. She drove out of town. She made it about 1.5 miles down the road before she stopped the horses and sat very still with her hands on the reins and let herself feel for exactly 3 minutes how completely trapped she was. Then she picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch. Thomas was on the barn roof when she pulled in. He looked down. He looked at the empty wagon bed. He came down the ladder. She told him straight. She had always believed in telling things straight, even when it would have been easier not to. She explained the supply store, the credit situation, the $42, the timber order. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She's the one holding the banknote," he said, not a question. "Found that out a few months ago. She's trying to put you under. She's been trying to put me under for years." Eleanor looked at the barn. "The question is, what we do about the timber. I might know a way." Thomas looked north toward the tree line about 3 miles out. "Those pines on the north border of your property, how old are they?" Eleanor frowned. 40 years, maybe. Some older. "And that section where the creek bends, where 3 of them came down in last winter's ice storm." She went still. "Those are already felled," Thomas said. "Lying on the ground, drying out. If we can get them milled." "The mill in Garrison will do custom cuts," Eleanor said slowly. "It's 15 miles. Farther than Caldwell's, but not Margaret Caldwell." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That's a 2-day trip," she said. "I know. The roof can't wait 2 days. Rain's coming Thursday if the sky's telling the truth. Then we work tonight and tomorrow on what we can do without the long timber, and we leave for Garrison Wednesday at first light." Eleanor put her hands on her hips and looked at the barn, and then at the sky, and then at Thomas Reed, who was standing in her yard like a man who had already decided this was his problem as much as hers, which was not a thing she had asked of him, and was not a thing she quite knew how to receive. "All right," she said. They worked through Tuesday night by lantern light. It was not romantic. It was exhausting and dirty, and Eleanor's back was in genuine agony by midnight, and she said so, not to ask for sympathy, but because she needed to say it out loud in order to keep moving through it. And Thomas handed her a piece of leather to bite down on and said, "Another 2 hours and we can stop," which was the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her in a moment of pain, because it was true, and it was specific, and it gave her something to aim for. By Wednesday morning, they had the barn weathered in enough to survive a moderate rain. They were on the road to Garrison by 6. Eleanor drove the first stretch. Thomas slept in the wagon bed, which she had not expected, and which told her how little rest he'd been running on since he arrived. She let him sleep. The Montana morning opened around her, the mountains pulling color out of the eastern sky, the frost on the grass glinting, the horses moving steady and warm in the cold air. And Eleanor drove and thought about very little, and felt for the first time in months something that was not quite peace, but was at least a pause. He woke up when the road got rough. "Your turn," she said. He took the reins without comment. They made Garrison by early afternoon, got the timber order placed, arranged for delivery, with a milling operator named Hector, who shook both their hands and shook Thomas's right hand with perfect normalcy, which Eleanor noted and which clearly meant something to Thomas, by the way his shoulders changed and started back. Halfway home, the sky went dark fast. "That's not Thursday rain," Thomas said. "No." Eleanor agreed. "That's today rain." They pushed the horses. They made it back to the ranch yard 20 minutes before the sky opened completely. They made it to the barn door. And then they were inside in the dry, breathing hard, with the rain hammering the partial roof above them, and the horses steaming and stamping, and Eleanor started to laugh. She didn't mean to. It came out of nowhere, out of the pure absurdity of all of it, the relief and the exhaustion and the fact that they had made it. And she stood in her barn, with her hair soaked and her boots waterlogged, and she laughed until she had to put her hand on a stall post to keep standing. Thomas looked at her. Then he started laughing too. They stayed in the barn until the worst of the storm passed, taking care of the horses, eating cold biscuits. Eleanor had packed that morning, not talking about anything important, just being 2 people who had run a very long race together and were allowed to stop running for a few minutes. It was the first time Eleanor Whitaker had laughed in longer than she could remember. She did not tell him that, but she thought about it that night in her father's old chair on the front porch, watching the rain taper off and the stars come back one by one in the washed sky. She thought about the way laughter had felt in her chest, unfamiliar, like using a muscle she had let atrophy. She thought about how it had taken a stranger, a man with a damaged hand and a baling twine-stitched jacket, to put it back there. She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with any of him. What she knew was that the barn would be repaired. She knew the timber was coming. She knew the 30-day clock was still running, and Margaret Caldwell's hand was still on the vise, and the cattle still needed feed, and the winter was still coming early. But she also knew that when she ran through the list of everything that needed doing, it still felt fractionally barely, but genuinely less absolute than it had the week before. She sat with that for a long time. Then the cold finally drove her inside, and she went to bed. And for the first time in 2 years, she did not lie awake doing arithmetic until the sky started to pale. She slept. And in the storage room off the back of the house, Thomas Reed lay on his narrow cot and listened to the last of the rain, and thought about fence lines repaired 17 different ways, and a woman who came down off a roof to tell him off and ended up showing him the beam angles instead. And he thought that of all the ranches he had walked away from in 6 years, this was the first one where walking away was not going to be simple. He wasn't sure what to do with that either. But the barn needed finishing. And there was always tomorrow. And in Montana, in the autumn of 1885, tomorrow was sometimes enough. The timber arrived Thursday morning, 3 days after the storm hauled in on Hector's mill wagon by 2 strong draft horses and a quiet teenage boy who didn't say much but worked fast. Eleanor was already in the yard when they pulled up. Thomas was right beside her. They unloaded in under 2 hours. And then the real work started. The barn repair shifted into a different phase, less assessment, more execution. Thomas had mapped the entire reconstruction in his head during the nights he couldn't sleep, and he laid it out for Eleanor, piece by piece each morning, before they climbed up, and she absorbed it the way she absorbed everything completely and without waste. She didn't need to be told twice. She didn't need encouragement. She needed information, and once she had it, she moved. They fell into a rhythm that neither of them named, because naming it would have made it something they'd have to think about, and thinking about it might have broken it. She handed up boards before he asked. He called measurements she had already estimated. When one of them hit a problem, the other had usually already started working around it. 5 days into the timber phase, Eleanor realized she had stopped mentally calculating how much faster 2 people were than one, because her brain had just accepted it as the new baseline. That was when Margaret Caldwell sent the first letter. It arrived with the Thursday Post rider tucked inside an envelope, with the neat copperplate handwriting that Eleanor would have recognized even without the Caldwell Supply return address pressed into the wax seal. She opened it standing at the gate, the post rider already halfway back down the road, and she read it once, and then folded it and put it in her apron pocket and finished the morning's work before she let herself think about it. At noon, Thomas came down off the roof for water and found her sitting on the porch steps with the letter open on her knee. "Bad news," he said. "Reminder," she said. "Margaret's reminding me the note comes due in 23 days. Thomas took the letter from her, which she allowed because she was too tired to argue about it. He read it. He handed it back. "She's accelerating," he said. "I know. That's not normal banking practice. The term should give you 30 days from the original notice. Margaret Caldwell doesn't operate in normal banking practice. She operates in Harlow County banking practice, which she invented." Eleanor folded the letter again. "She's done this to 3 other families that I know of. The Pattersons, the Greer family, the Holloways. Squeezed the note when they were most vulnerable, bought the land at a fraction of value when they defaulted." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Did any of them fight it?" "The Pattersons tried. They went to the county courthouse with the original loan documents, argued the terms. Margaret had already had a conversation with the county clerk, who happened to owe her an outstanding favor. The filing got delayed. The deadline passed. That's fraud. That's Harlow County." Eleanor stood up. "Come on, we've got 4 more hours of light." "Eleanor." She stopped. She hadn't heard him say her name before, just her name without the ma'am attached. It stopped her more than she expected. "We need to talk about this," he said. "After the roof. The roof doesn't matter if you lose the land under it." She turned around. He was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her, and his expression was the same one he'd used the very first day when he'd told her the beam was cracked in 2 places she hadn't reached yet. Not pity, assessment. The face of someone who had already started solving the problem and needed her to catch up. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "I don't have the money to pay the note." "How much is it?" $412. He didn't flinch. What if the note isn't valid? Eleanor stared at him. What do you mean? Your father took the loan originally. From who? Garrison Territorial Bank. Margaret's company bought the note from them 6 months after my father died. Did you see the transfer documents? The bank sent me a notice. That's not the same thing. He crossed his arms. A notice that a note has been transferred isn't the same as legal documentation of the transfer terms. If the transfer included any modification of the original terms, interest rate adjustment acceleration clauses that weren't in the original agreement, those modifications have to be disclosed and consented to. Eleanor was very still. Where would I find the original documents? He asked. My father kept everything in the locked box in the office. Have you gone through it? She had not gone through it. She had opened the box the week after her father died, seen his handwriting on the top document, and closed it again and not been back. She had told herself she would when she was ready. 2 years later, she was apparently still not ready. No, she said. Thomas held her gaze. I think we need to go through that box tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her that she didn't quite have a name for. Not gratitude. Gratitude was too simple. Something more like the sensation of a locked door being knocked on from the outside by someone who wasn't demanding entry, just making it known they were there. After supper, she said. After supper, he agreed. They went back up on the roof for the afternoon, and neither of them mentioned it again until the lanterns were lit and the supper dishes were cleared, and Eleanor brought the locked metal box out of the office and set it on the kitchen table. She had the key on a chain around her neck. She had always worn it because her father had always worn it, and giving it to her had been one of the last deliberate things he'd done. She unlocked the box. The smell of old paper and her father's pipe tobacco came up out of it. She breathed through that. Thomas sat across from her and waited. He didn't reach for anything. He let her be the one to go through the box, which told her something important about how he understood people. That there are moments when a person needs to be the one doing the thing, even if help is right there. The loan documents were near the bottom. She found the original agreement first. Robert Whitaker, dated March 1879. Garrison Territorial Bank. $350 at 7% annually over 10 years with specific repayment terms that were written in clear plain language, which had apparently been a point of pride for the Garrison bank manager because he had initialed every page. Then she found the transfer documents. Or rather, she found the document that Margaret Caldwell's company had sent calling itself a transfer notice. Thomas looked at it for a long time. This isn't a transfer document, he said. What is it? It's a letter asserting that the note has been transferred. It references an agreement between Caldwell Holdings and Garrison Territorial Bank. He set it flat on the table and pointed. But it doesn't include the original note endorsed by the bank. It doesn't include the terms of the transfer. And right here, his finger moved, this acceleration clause. 30 days to full payment upon any change in property ownership or management. Eleanor leaned in. My father never agreed to an acceleration clause. I know, because it's not in the original document. Thomas looked up. Eleanor, if Margaret Caldwell modified the terms of this loan when she claimed to purchase it and never disclosed that to you, that is not a legal modification. You never signed it. You never agreed to it. The kitchen was very quiet. Can I prove that? Eleanor asked. You have the original agreement. You have her letter. Anyone who can read both documents can see that the acceleration clause doesn't exist in the original. He sat back. The question is whether the county clerk will see it, or whether Margaret's already had a conversation there too. Eleanor thought. The circuit judge, she said slowly. Judge Harlan rides the circuit through Harlow County in the fall. He's independent out of Billings, no connection to local interests. When does he come through? Late October usually. Could be 3 weeks. Could be 5. Is that before or after your 23 days? Eleanor closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. After, she said. Then we need another way. Thomas tapped the table lightly, thinking. The original lender. The Garrison bank manager who wrote those initialed pages. Is he still there? He was a year ago, man named Aldous Price. If he confirms that the original note had no acceleration clause, and that any transfer should have come with full disclosure of the original terms. That's a sworn statement. That has weight. Garrison is 15 miles. I know. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, across the open metal box, with her father's handwriting on every page, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. She had been careful with hope for a long time, but the sense that there was a move to make, that she was not simply waiting for the vice to close. "I'll go Saturday," she said. "We'll go Saturday," Thomas said. She started to argue. He looked at her steadily, and she stopped. "All right," she said. "We'll go Saturday." They rode into Garrison on Saturday morning, and everything went fine until they arrived at the bank and found a notice on the door stating that Aldous Price had retired from his position at Garrison Territorial Bank 4 months ago. Eleanor stood in front of that notice for a moment. Then she pushed the door open and went inside anyway. The new bank manager was a young man named Forsyth, with clean hands and the careful diction of someone recently arrived from back east, and he listened to Eleanor with the expression of a man desperately hoping the conversation would end soon. He confirmed that yes, Aldous Price had retired. He confirmed that yes, the bank had sold several outstanding notes to private parties the previous year. He did not confirm anything about the terms of those sales, because he had not been present, and the records were, unfortunately, he said with genuine-sounding regret, archived in a filing system that would take considerable time to locate. "How considerable?" Thomas asked. "Weeks," Forsyth said. "Possibly longer." "We don't have weeks," Eleanor said. "I'm aware that's unfortunate, Miss Whitaker." Eleanor leaned forward on his desk slightly. "Mr. Forsyth, I need the name and location of Aldous Price." "I couldn't give out that. I am asking for the retired address of a man who can provide a sworn statement that may prevent a fraud from being committed in your bank's name." Her voice was level, not raised, just very, very clear. "If Margaret Caldwell has modified the terms of a note that originated with this institution, and done so without proper disclosure, your bank has potential liability in that transaction. I imagine that would be of interest to your supervisors in Billings." Forsyth's clean hands went very still on his desk. He found Aldous Price's home address in under 4 minutes. Price lived 6 miles outside Garrison on a small property he'd purchased with his retirement savings, and he was in his garden when they rode up a compact, white-haired man with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades being careful with other people's money. He remembered Robert Whitaker immediately. "Solid man," Price said, walking them into his kitchen, putting a kettle on without being asked. "Came in with his daughter once, maybe 1880, 1881. Girl about 14 or 15. Already asking better questions about the loan terms than most adults." Thomas glanced at Eleanor. Eleanor did not react to this, but something in her jaw changed very slightly. "Do you remember the terms of the loan?" Thomas asked. "I remember every loan I wrote in 22 years. Price sat down with the certainty of that statement. Whitaker note was $350 at 7% 10-year term. Standard terms. No prepayment penalty, no acceleration clause. He paused. "No acceleration clause," he repeated with an emphasis that said he had heard what they were actually asking. "Margaret Caldwell's company is claiming there is one," Eleanor said. Price's face did something complicated. "Is she now? She's demanding full payment in 23 days or foreclosure." The old man was quiet for a moment. "That clause was not in the note I wrote. If it appeared after the transfer, it was added after, without the original borrower's consent." He looked at Eleanor directly. "That's not legal in any territory I'm aware of." "Would you put that in writing?" Eleanor asked. "I would," Price said. "I'll put it in writing, and I'll sign it in front of a witness, and you can take it to the circuit judge, or the territorial attorney general, or the front page of the Billings newspaper, if it comes to that." He paused. "Your father was a good man. He deserved better than a vulture picking his bones after he was gone." Eleanor was very still. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, completely steady, which was the most control she had ever exercised over a voice in her entire life. Price wrote the statement at his kitchen table. He signed it. His neighbor, who came over for reasons unrelated to anything, was recruited as witness, and signed it without even fully understanding why, just that Aldous Price needed a witness, and he was the kind of neighbor who showed up when he was needed. They rode back to the ranch in the long afternoon light with the signed statement in Eleanor's coat pocket. Halfway back, Thomas said, "You were going to cry in there." "I wasn't," Eleanor said. "You were. You held it." "I said I wasn't." A pause. "You were his daughter," Thomas said quietly. "That's all I meant." Eleanor kept her eyes on the road. "I used to let me come to the bank with him," she said after a while. "Every time he made a payment, he said I should know what it meant to keep a promise, even when keeping it was hard." She paused. "I didn't know Price remembered that." Thomas said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. They got back to the ranch as the last light was leaving the sky. But if Eleanor thought the signed statement in her pocket meant the pressure was going to ease, she learned differently on Monday morning when she drove into town for feed and found that something had changed in the way people looked at her. It was subtle, the kind of change you felt before you saw it. The way the conversation at Hartley's feed stopped a beat too late when she walked in. The way Mrs. Norris from the church auxiliary suddenly needed to examine a display of leather goods on the opposite side of the room when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. The way Jim Hartley himself, who had sold her father feed for 15 years and sold Eleanor feed for 2 years after that, found something very interesting to look at on the ceiling while he tallied her order. She knew this pattern. She had felt it before. It was the particular social weather that meant someone had been saying things about her. She didn't have to wait long to find out what. Ada Hollis, who cleaned the church on Mondays, and therefore knew everything about everyone in Harlow County before most people knew it about themselves, materialized at Eleanor's elbow near the flour barrels with the specific expression of someone carrying news they weren't entirely happy about carrying. "Eleanor," Ada said quietly, "you should know what's being said." "I figured I should," Eleanor said. "What is it?" Ada leaned in. "Margaret's been telling people that you've taken a man into your home who nobody knows anything about. She's saying it's improper, that you're desperate." Ada's voice dropped further. "And she's saying that the kind of man who would go to a woman like you is the kind of man who has nowhere else to go." Eleanor stood with a 10-pound bag of flour in her arms and felt each one of those words land where they were aimed. A woman like you. She had heard that phrase in 100 different configurations her entire life. It always meant the same thing. It always hit the same place. And Eleanor Whitaker had gotten very good at not showing where that place was, because the world had a way of digging harder into wounds it discovered. "Is that all?" Eleanor asked. Ada looked at her with the helpless sympathy of someone who genuinely likes a person and genuinely cannot make the world less cruel for them. "I thought you should know from a friend before you heard it from someone less kindly disposed." "Thank you, Ada." Eleanor paid for her feed. She loaded the wagon. She drove back to the ranch. Thomas was working on the final section of the roof when she pulled in. He came down when he heard the wagon. He took one look at her face. "What happened?" she told him. He listened without interrupting. His face went through something while she talked, not anger exactly, or not only anger. Something quieter and more settled than anger. The expression of a man who has heard this particular type of cruelty before and has stopped being surprised by it and hasn't stopped being affected by it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is any of it true?" he asked. She blinked. "What? Is it true that I have nowhere else to go?" He met her eyes steadily. "Because I think that depends on how you define it. I have legs. I could leave tomorrow. I'm here because I choose to be here. And Margaret Caldwell can define that however she likes, but she doesn't get to decide what it means." Eleanor stared at him. "And as for the rest of it," he said, "the part about you, Eleanor, the only people that kind of talk serves are the people doing the talking. The question isn't what Margaret says about you. The question is what you know about yourself." She crossed her arms. Not defensively, more like she was holding something in place. "I know what I know," she said. "Then that's enough." But it was not quite enough, and both of them knew it, because the next morning, Thomas drove into Harlow to pick up a hardware item they needed, and came back with his jaw set in a particular way that told Eleanor something had happened before she asked. "Hartley wouldn't serve me," he said. Eleanor went very still. "Told me the store wasn't equipped to help someone who came into the county with no references, no property, and no visible means of—" Thomas stopped, pressed his mouth together. I walked out before he finished the sentence. "Margaret," Eleanor said. "Margaret," he confirmed. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the surface the way she had the night she first read the foreclosure notice, grounding herself, thinking. "She's trying to cut us off," Eleanor said. "If she can isolate the ranch from supplies and social support." "She's done this before," Thomas said. "You said the Pattersons, the Holloways. Both left within 6 months of the pressure starting. How many people in this county are in debt to her?" Eleanor thought about it. Truly thought about it, not just the families she knew directly, but the larger web of obligations that Margaret Caldwell had spent decades weaving through Harlow County. The supply accounts, the grain elevator interest, the notes purchased from failing banks. "Maybe half the farming families," she said slowly. "Maybe more." Thomas sat down across from her. "Eleanor, if there are other families whose debt notes were modified the same way yours was, acceleration clauses added without consent. Terms changed after the fact. Aldous Price's statement isn't just relevant to your case. It's relevant to all of theirs." She looked at him. "You're talking about something a lot bigger than my barn roof," she said. "I'm talking about what's actually happening, what has been happening." He leaned forward. "You're not the only one she's doing this to. You're just the one who went to Garrison and found out." The kitchen was very quiet. "If I go after her publicly," Eleanor said, "and I fail, I lose the ranch. I lose everything." "Yes. And if I stay quiet and just fight my own case, you might save your ranch. And every other family she does this to next year, and the year after that, nobody warned them." He paused. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see." Eleanor looked at the wall, at the window, at the flour sack she'd hung from the ceiling beam to keep the mice out, which was a thing her father had taught her, which was a thing she would lose along with every other thing in this house if the note came due and she couldn't fight it. "Who would listen?" she said. "The county clerk's in her pocket. The circuit judge isn't here for weeks. The newspaper in Harlow is—" "Not Harlow," Thomas said. "The Billings paper. They've run stories on frontier banking corruption before. And a sworn statement from a retired bank manager about modified loan terms. That's not gossip. That's documentation." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've thought about a lot of things since I walked through your gate." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she meant to. Something moved in her chest again, that unfamiliar thing, the thing she had been carefully not naming, because she was a woman who had survived 36 years in this body, in this county, in this life, by being very careful about what she let herself want. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need." He stood. "I'm going back on the roof." She watched him go. She stayed at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood for a long time, and she thought about her father, who had kept his promises even when keeping them was hard, and about Aldous Price, who had remembered a 14-year-old girl asking better questions than the adults, and about 3 families who had already lost their land to the same vice that was closing on her now. She thought about Thomas, who had arrived with a torn jacket and a damaged hand, and had never once looked at her the way the world looked at her. And she thought about what kind of woman she was going to be when this was over. She had always believed in telling things straight. This was just a larger thing than she'd ever had to tell before. She stood up from the table. She went to the office. She got out paper and a pen, and she began writing a letter to the Billings Gazette. The letter took her 3 nights to write. Not because she didn't know what to say. Eleanor had always known what to say. The difficulty was saying it in a way that couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be laughed off, couldn't be folded back into the narrative that Margaret Caldwell had spent years building about the large, lonely woman on the failing ranch who was too stubborn to admit defeat. She wrote the first draft, and it was too angry. She could feel the anger in every sentence, hot and visible, and she knew that an angry woman was easy to ignore. An angry large woman was easier still. She wrote the second draft, and it was too careful, too hedged, Too many qualifications, softening every fact until the facts themselves went blurry. The third draft she wrote the way her father had taught her to keep accounts. Clearly, chronologically, with every number attached to a document and every claim attached to a name. She laid out the original loan terms. She laid out the transfer notice that wasn't a transfer document. She laid out the acceleration clause that had never been agreed to. She named Aldous Price and his 22 years at Garrison Territorial Bank and quoted his signed statement verbatim. Then she named the Patterson family, the Greer family, the Holloways. She did not call Margaret Caldwell a criminal. She simply described with precise and documented clarity what Margaret Caldwell had done. She signed it, Eleanor May Whitaker, and she wrote her full address beneath the signature. Thomas read it at the kitchen table the morning she finished it. He read it twice. He set it down. "This will make her come after you harder," he said. "I know. Are you ready for that?" Eleanor picked up the letter. "I've been getting ready for it my entire life." She folded it into the envelope. "I just didn't know what it was going to be about." She mailed it in Harlow on a Wednesday, which she did deliberately driving past Caldwell's Supply on the way to the post office, with her back straight and her chin level and the envelope in her hand, and she did not look at Margaret's store window on the way by, but she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a fire when you walk past it. The heat on the side of your face. She mailed the letter and she drove home, and she went back up on the barn roof because the barn was not going to finish itself and the world was not going to pause for her decisions. 3 days later, Margaret Caldwell came to the ranch. Eleanor heard the buggy coming down the road and knew it before she could see it. There was a particular speed to Margaret's horses, a particular clip of hooves that said the driver was in a hurry and not trying to hide it. She came down off the ladder and stood in the yard. Thomas came around from the side of the barn and stood slightly behind her and to the left, which was not a position he had taken by accident. Margaret stopped the buggy. She got down without waiting for anyone to help her. She walked toward Eleanor with the specific precision of a woman who had practiced this approach in her mind and was going to execute it exactly as planned. "I want to talk to you about what you've done," Margaret said. "Good morning, Margaret." "Don't." Margaret stopped 2 feet from her. Up close, the composure was perfect, but something underneath it was not. Something behind her eyes was moving faster than the rest of her face. "You sent a letter to the Billings Gazette." "I did." "Containing defamatory statements about my business." "Containing documented facts about your business," Eleanor said. "There's a difference." "Eleanor." Margaret's voice dropped into something that was almost personal, almost human, which was more unsettling than the precision had been. "I have been patient with you. I purchased that note to give you time not to take your land. What you have done is—" "Margaret." Eleanor kept her voice level. "You added an acceleration clause to a loan my father signed without that clause. You have used that fraudulent clause to demand full payment from me in less than 30 days. Aldous Price has put that in writing. His signature is on a document that says exactly what the original note contained and what it did not." She paused. "I'm not defaming you. I'm describing what you did." Margaret was very still. Then something changed in her face. The almost human quality disappeared. What replaced it was something harder and older and more honest than anything Eleanor had seen from her before. "You have no idea what you're starting," Margaret said. "I think I have a reasonable idea. I have relationships with every county official, every merchant, every bank within 40 miles of this property. You will not be able to buy supplies. You will not find labor. Your cattle buyer will decline your contract. Your grain buyer will find reasons. I've mailed copies of Price's statement and the original loan documents to the Billings Gazette, the Territorial Attorney General's office, and the Circuit Judge's chambers in Billings," Eleanor said, "along with a request that the Patterson, Greer, and Holloway family situations be examined under the same framework." Margaret Caldwell went white. Not pale. White. The color left her face the way water leaves a broken vessel fast and complete. "You're bluffing," she said. "I'm really not," Eleanor said. Thomas spoke then from behind Eleanor's left shoulder, quiet and even. "The Pattersons are still in the county. So are 2 of the Greer children. If the Attorney General opens an inquiry, they'll have something to say. Margaret turned to look at Thomas with an expression that Eleanor had never quite seen directed at another person. The particular contempt of someone who has just been beaten by a combination they did not see coming and needs to direct that somewhere. "And who are you exactly?" Margaret said. "A broken-handed drifter who showed up here with nothing. You think anyone in this county is going to take your word over mine?" Thomas held her gaze without moving, without shifting, without any of the flinching that Eleanor suspected most men did under that particular look. "Ma'am," he said, "this has nothing to do with my word. It's Aldous Price's word, and the original documents, and the Attorney General who is appointed from Billings and has no favors owed in Harlow County." A pause. "I'm just the man standing in the yard." Margaret looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to Eleanor. "You will regret this," she said. It came out differently than the earlier threats, less calculated, more personal. The kind of thing said not as strategy, but as truth, which made it more frightening, not less. "Maybe," Eleanor said. "But I'd regret it more if I stayed quiet." Margaret got back in her buggy. She turned it around. She drove back down the road at exactly the same precise clip she had arrived with, and Eleanor watched her go and kept her shoulders back until the sound of the hooves was entirely gone. Then she turned around and sat down on the porch steps and put her hands on her knees and said absolutely nothing. Thomas sat down next to her, not saying anything either, just being there. After a while he said, "Did you actually mail copies to the Attorney General?" "I mailed them this morning before I told you I was going to," Eleanor said. "I didn't want you to talk me out of it." He looked at her. "I wouldn't have talked you out of it," he said. "I know. But I didn't want to find out if I was wrong about that." I was quiet. Then something in his face moved, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives just under a smile, the thing that means a person is genuinely helplessly fond of something. He looked away before Eleanor could decide what to do with having seen that. What happened next came faster than either of them expected. The Billings Gazette ran a short item the following Tuesday, not the full story, not yet, but a notice that the paper had received documentation regarding alleged fraudulent loan modifications in Harlow County and was investigating. It was 4 sentences long. It might as well have been a cannon shot. By Wednesday morning, Eleanor had 3 visitors. The first was Ada Hollis, who arrived at 7 in the morning with a jar of preserved peaches and the news that half the town was talking and the other half was pretending not to be. "What are they saying?" Eleanor asked. "Some of them are saying you've lost your mind," Ada said, "and some of them are saying it's about time." "Which half is which?" "The ones who owe Margaret money are saying it's about time," Ada said. Quietly, very quietly, but saying it. The second visitor was a man Eleanor didn't know at first. Weathered older with the particular posture of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long they'd forgotten what straight felt like. He introduced himself as Calvin Patterson, James Patterson's father, the family who had lost their land 2 years ago. He stood in her yard with his hat in his hands and said, "Miss Whitaker, I heard what you've done. I have documents from when we tried to fight it. The county clerk told us our filing was late, but I kept copies of everything because my wife said to, and I didn't understand why until now." Eleanor felt something happen in her chest. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." The third visitor arrived in the afternoon and was the one she least expected. His name was Samuel Greer, and he was 22 years old, the eldest son of the Greer family whose land had been lost 3 years ago. He arrived on a horse that had been ridden hard, and he got down, and he looked at Eleanor with eyes that were red-rimmed and urgent. "My mother got a letter this morning," he said, "from Margaret Caldwell's lawyer. It says if my mother says anything to any investigator or newspaper about the loan situation, Margaret's company will pursue a defamation claim against her." Eleanor's jaw tightened. Thomas was beside her in the yard. He said, "She's trying to silence the witnesses." "She figured out what we're doing," Eleanor said. "Miss Whitaker." Samuel's voice cracked slightly at the edges. "My mother's sick. She doesn't have money for a lawyer. She's scared. She told me not to come here." He gripped his hat. "I came anyway because what Margaret Caldwell did to our family." He stopped, started again. "We lost everything. Everything. My father spent the rest of his life believing he'd failed us. He died believing that. His voice broke clean in half. He didn't fail us. She stole from us. And someone should say so. Eleanor looked at this young man who had ridden hard through a Montana morning to stand in her yard with a broken voice and his hat in his hands. And she thought about her own father, who had kept his promises even when keeping them was hard, and about the girl she had been at 14 who had gone to the bank with him and asked questions, and about the women and men and families all across Harlow County who had been told they were not enough and had believed it because they had no one standing next to them saying otherwise. She stepped forward and put her hand on Samuel Greer's arm. "Tell your mother she won't stand alone," she said. He looked at her like a man who had not expected to receive that and didn't know where to put it. "How?" he said. "Because she won't be the one speaking," Eleanor said. "I will, and Calvin Patterson will, and Aldous Price already has. Margaret Caldwell can threaten your mother all she likes. She cannot threaten everyone at once." Eleanor looked at Thomas briefly. He gave her nothing but steady. She turned back to Samuel. "You tell your mother to keep her documents safe, and you tell her that Eleanor Whitaker is asking her to trust her for a little longer." After Samuel left, Thomas found Eleanor in the office, sitting at her father's desk, with the box of documents open again, going through everything for the third time. "You know what she's going to do next," he said. "Try to accelerate the note before the Attorney General can respond," Eleanor said. "File in county court. Use the county clerk to push it through before the circuit judge has a chance to weigh in." "Can she?" "Legally, no. The circuit court has precedence on contested debt claims." She looked up. "But Margaret doesn't operate in legal. She operates in Harlow County, which she invented. Then we need to make it impossible for her to contain this locally." Thomas came to the desk. He leaned on it with both hands and looked at the documents she'd spread out. "You said the circuit judge is expected through in 3 to 5 weeks. Maybe. What would it take to get him here sooner?" Eleanor looked at him. "A formal request," she said slowly. "From multiple parties. If Calvin Patterson and I both file requests for expedited circuit review on the same matter. And if you can get even one more family." "The Holloways," Eleanor said. "They're still in the county. I know where they are." "Then we need to move tomorrow." "Thomas." She sat back. "If this fails, if the circuit judge doesn't come through, or Margaret gets to the county court first, or the Attorney General decides it's not worth his time." She stopped, made herself say it plainly. "I lose this land, my father's land, everything he spent 30 years building." Thomas looked at her with the same steadiness he had offered her from the first morning, from the moment he had come down off that roof and told her the beam was cracked in 2 places she hadn't reached yet. "I know," he said. "I need you to know that I know what I'm risking. I'm not brave. I'm just—" She stopped again. "I'm just out of other options, Eleanor." His voice was very quiet. "You have been the bravest person in this county for longer than anyone's given you credit for. You don't have to explain it as something less than what it is." She looked at him for a moment that stretched a little longer than it should have. She picked up the pen. "Go get some sleep," she said. "We leave for the Holloways at dawn." They found the Holloways in a rented house on the east edge of Harlow, 3 miles from the land they used to own. Ruth Holloway was a small, fierce woman of 60 who had clearly been waiting for exactly this conversation and had the documents out before Eleanor finished explaining why she had come. "I've kept every piece of paper that came from that woman," Ruth said. "Every letter, every notice, every fake transfer document. I've kept it all in a box under my bed for 3 years, waiting for someone to tell me it was worth something." Eleanor put her hand on Ruth Holloway's kitchen table. "It's worth a great deal," she said. Ruth looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite relief, and was something that existed only in people who have stopped believing in good things happening, and are therefore entirely unprepared for when they start. "She told me nobody would believe me," Ruth said. "She told me I was too small to fight her." "She's told a lot of people things like that," Eleanor said. "She was wrong every time." They filed the expedited circuit review request from the county courthouse at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. 3 names on the petition: Eleanor Whitaker, Calvin Patterson. Ruth Holloway. And they did it in full view of the county clerk who happened to be in the building, who happened to have a particular look on his face throughout the entire filing process that said he was already composing a message to Margaret Caldwell in his head. Eleanor signed the petition last. She pressed the pen down firmly. She handed it back to the young deputy recorder, who was not the clerk himself, and who had therefore presumably not yet been compromised. And she said, "Please make sure this is transmitted to the circuit court in Billings today." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he had the look of a young man who understood that something significant was happening and wanted to be on the right side of it. They walked out of the courthouse into the October air. Calvin Patterson put his hat on. Ruth Holloway pulled her coat tighter. Thomas stood slightly back and said nothing, which was the right thing. "What do we do now?" Calvin asked. "We go home," Eleanor said. "And we wait. And we keep all our documents in a safe place. And if she comes after us in the meantime, then we deal with that when it comes." Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Patterson, you did a brave thing today." "I did a late thing," he said, and his voice was thick with something she recognized because she felt it too. Sometimes the weight of all the years of keeping quiet. "Late is still not never," she said. He nodded. He shook Thomas's hand. He walked to his horse and rode east, and Eleanor watched him go, and thought about the particular kind of courage that it took to do the right thing when the right thing came a few years too late to save everything you'd already lost. The circuit judge's advance letter arrived 11 days later. Eleanor was patching a section of fence line when Thomas ran it out to her actually running, which she had never seen him do, and the sight of it made her heart rate jump before she even took the letter from his hand. The circuit judge had received the expedited petition. He had also, it transpired, received a communication from the Territorial Attorney General's office regarding the Billings Gazette inquiry and the supporting documentation. He would be arriving in Harlow County in 6 days, not 3 to 5 weeks. 6 days. Eleanor read the letter twice. She handed it back to Thomas. She turned around and looked at the fence post she had been driving, and she hit it 3 more times with the post driver. 1, 2, 3, solid, deliberate, with everything she had, because she needed to do something physical with what was happening inside her chest. Then she turned back around. 6 days, she said. 6 days, Thomas confirmed. She looked at him. He was holding the letter and looking at her, and the October light was on his face, and something in his expression was open in a way that she had only glimpsed before. Usually he was careful, contained, measured in everything he showed. He was not being careful right now. He was just looking at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely glad exists in the world. Eleanor looked away first. "We have a lot to do," she said. "We do," he agreed. But Margaret Caldwell had received the same courthouse notification, and Margaret Caldwell did not spend the intervening 6 days quietly. By the next morning she had moved. She had filed an emergency debt claim in county court, not circuit court. County court, where the clerk she had cultivated for 30 years handled the paperwork asserting that the Whitaker note was in immediate default and requesting a county court judgment that would supersede any circuit review. Eleanor found out from Ada Hollis, who found out from the deputy recorder, who found out at 7 in the morning and had the integrity to be troubled by it. Thomas was eating breakfast when Eleanor came back into the kitchen with the news. He set his fork down. "She's trying to get the county court to move before the circuit judge arrives," Eleanor said. "Can she? County courts don't have jurisdiction over contested debt disputes that involve fraudulent documentation. The circuit court does. She knows that." Eleanor paced. "But if she can get a county court ruling on record, even an invalid one, it creates a procedural tangle that could take months to unwind. And in those months, the land is in dispute. She controls it as the note holder." Thomas stood up. "You need a lawyer." "I need a lawyer in the next—" Eleanor checked the wall calendar. 5 days. "In Billings, not Harlow." "I know." She stopped pacing. "I know someone. My father used a man named Gideon Cross for the original land title when he bought the property. He's still practicing, I think. He's nearly 70. Is he good?" "My father said he was the most honest lawyer he ever met, which in 1865 Montana was not a common thing to be." "Can you get to Billings and back in time?" Eleanor calculated. If I leave tomorrow at first light and push the horses. We leave tomorrow at first light, Thomas said. You don't need to come. Eleanor. He said her name again the way he had that first time without the ma'am, just her name, like it was the whole sentence. I'm coming. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. They made Billings in a day and a half. Gideon Cross was in his office when they arrived, a spare, white-haired man who looked at Eleanor's documents with the focused intensity of someone whose mind had never slowed down, regardless of what his body was doing. And he read Aldous Price's statement, and he read the original loan documents, and he read Margaret's transfer notice, and he set everything down very carefully. This is a clear case, he said. Then why is it so complicated? Eleanor said. Because Margaret Caldwell has spent 40 years making everything in Harlow County complicated on purpose. He looked at her over his glasses. Your father was Robert Whittaker. Yes. I wrote his land title in 1865. A pause. I'm taking this case, and I'm not charging you until we win. Eleanor stared at him. Mr. Cross, I'm 71 years old, he said. I have more money than I need and less time than I'd like. I intend to spend what time I have doing something worth the effort. He picked up the documents again. I'll file for an injunction against the county court proceeding before the end of today. That will hold Margaret's filing in suspension until the circuit judge arrives. And when he arrives, you'll have representation that's had 30 years more practice in territorial law than anyone Margaret Caldwell can hire. Eleanor felt something she had been carefully not feeling for a very long time. She felt it anyway. She took a breath. Thank you, she said. The old lawyer looked at her with the particular kindness of someone who has seen enough of the world to know what it cost a proud woman to say those two words and mean them completely. Thank your father, he said. He built something worth keeping. That night in the small boarding house where they took rooms for the night before the drive back. Eleanor sat at the small table in her room and wrote 2 letters. One to Calvin Patterson, telling him what had happened. One to Ruth Holloway, telling her to hold steady. She heard a soft knock at the door. Thomas's voice. You should sleep. Soon, she said. A pause. She heard him not leave. Come in, she said. He opened the door and stood in the doorway, not coming in fully. He had his jacket off his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with the physical work. The kind of tired that came from caring about something and not knowing how it was going to end. Are you all right? He asked. I don't know, she said, which was the most honest answer she had given anyone in years. He nodded. He didn't offer her an easier answer than that. Thomas. She set down her pen. Why are you still here? He looked at her. I mean that genuinely, she said. You came to help fix a barn. The barn is fixed. What's happening now is dangerous. It could go wrong. If it goes wrong, you lose. She stopped. You don't lose anything. You're not attached to this land. You could walk away. Yes, he said. Then why haven't you? He was quiet for a long moment. Because somewhere around the 3rd morning on that roof, he said, this stopped being just a barn. Eleanor looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The space between what he had just said and whatever came next was wide and significant, and both of them knew it, and both of them were each for their own reasons not quite ready to cross it. Get some sleep, Thomas, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am, he said. He went. Eleanor sat at the table for a long time after the door closed. She pressed her hands flat on the surface in front of her. She breathed. Then she finished her letters, blew out the lamp, and lay in the dark, and let herself feel for exactly as long as she needed to every single thing she had been too busy surviving to feel. Tomorrow they rode back to Harlow County. Tomorrow the clock started its final count toward the circuit judge's arrival. Tomorrow, Margaret Caldwell would discover that the county court injunction had been filed and would begin whatever came next. But tonight, for the first time, Eleanor Whittaker allowed herself to believe that what came next might not destroy her. And that was enough. They rode back into Harlow County on a Thursday morning, and Eleanor could feel the change before she saw it. It was in the air, the way weather was in the air, not visible yet, but present. The particular tension of a small town that had been talking about something and had not yet decided what it believed. Ada Hollis was waiting at the ranch gate. That was not a good sign. Ada had never come to the ranch uninvited. She was standing by her horse with her hands clasped in front of her, and when she saw Eleanor coming down the road, she started toward her immediately, which told Eleanor whatever she was carrying, it was heavy. She moved, Ada said before Eleanor had fully stopped the wagon. Margaret, yesterday afternoon, she went to every merchant in town and she called in every favor she has ever been owed. Hartley's won't extend credit to anyone associated with this ranch. The grain buyer in town is refusing to honor your fall contract, and... Ada stopped, pressed her lips together. She's been to the church. She spoke with Pastor Renner. She told him that you have been conducting yourself improperly with a man not your husband, and she asked him to address it from the pulpit on Sunday. Eleanor sat very still on the wagon seat. Thomas beside her said nothing, but Eleanor could feel the change in him, the way you feel a drop in temperature, a tightening, a stillness, something contained by pure will. "What did Pastor Renner say?" Eleanor asked. "He hasn't decided," Ada said. But Margaret spent an hour with him, and she came out looking satisfied, which means she believes she convinced him. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon. "Ada," she said, "thank you for coming. What are you going to do?" "Finish unpacking," Eleanor said. "And then I'm going to talk to Pastor Renner myself." Ada blinked. "Tonight. Right now." Ada looked at her with the expression of a woman who admired someone greatly and was also mildly terrified for them. "I'll come with you." "No." Eleanor straightened her coat. "This one I do alone." She walked into town. Knott Road walked deliberately the 8 miles into Harlow because she needed to move, and she needed to think, and she needed to arrive with her head clear and her feet on solid ground. She had walked this road her whole life. Every rock in it was familiar. She arrived at the parsonage and knocked. Pastor Renner was a lean man of 55 who had always struck Eleanor as fundamentally decent, but unfortunately susceptible to whoever the most recent powerful person to speak to him had been. He looked surprised to see her, which meant he hadn't expected her to come, which meant Margaret had told him she wouldn't. Margaret had underestimated her again. "Miss Whitaker," he said. I'd like to talk to you, Pastor," she said. "If you have a few minutes." He let her in. She sat across from him in his study, and she laid it out plainly, the way she laid out everything. No drama, no tears, no performance. She told him about Thomas's work on the barn. She told him about the separate sleeping arrangements. She told him about Gideon Cross and the circuit judge. She told him about the signed statement from Aldous Price. Then she said, "Pastor, I have spent 36 years in this county, living as honestly as I know how to live. I have never asked this community for charity. I have never defaulted on a debt. I have never spoken ill of a neighbor without cause. And I am asking you now to weigh those 36 years against 1 hour of Margaret Caldwell telling you what she needs you to believe." Renner was quiet. "She is a significant contributor to this parish," he said finally. "I know." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "And I am asking you to decide what a parish is for." He was quiet for a long time. "I have not decided what I will say on Sunday," he said. I told her the same. "I know. She came out of here looking satisfied anyway." Eleanor stood. "I'm not asking you to speak for me, Pastor. I'm asking you not to speak against me, that's all." She walked back out. She walked the 8 miles home in the last of the afternoon light, and she didn't think about whether it had worked, because she had done what she could, and the rest was not in her hands. Thomas was at the gate when she came back up the road. He had been waiting. She could see it in the way he was standing, not working, not moving, just standing at the gate in the October cold, with his jacket collar up and his eyes on the road in the direction of town. When he saw her coming, he stood up straight, and something in his face unlocked. "How did it go?" he asked. "Don't know yet," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm hungry, and I want to sit down." "Good," he said. "Because supper's been ready for an hour and a half. She stopped. She looked at him. He had cooked supper. Not a complicated supper. She could smell from here that it was beans and cornbread, the simplest things, the things any person could put together. But he had done it while she was gone, while he was waiting, because he had known she would come back tired, and he had wanted there to be something ready. She did not say anything about it. She walked past him toward the house and said, "5 minutes, I need to wash my hands." "Take your time," he said. She stood at the wash basin and put her face in her wet hands and breathed. Then she dried off and went and sat at the kitchen table and ate supper with Thomas Reed in the comfortable quiet that had become the shape of their evenings. And for a little while, she allowed herself not to think about Margaret Caldwell or the circuit judge or Sunday's sermon or any of it. Just supper. Just this. Just enough. The first real crack in Margaret Caldwell's foundation appeared the following morning and came from a direction nobody expected. It came from George Hartley, Jim Hartley's older brother, who had retired from the family feed store 3 years ago and lived quietly on the edge of town with his wife Mabel, and a dozen chickens showed up at Eleanor's ranch just after breakfast. He was a big, slow-moving man who had always given Eleanor the impression of a person who made decisions very deliberately and then stuck to them absolutely. He got down from his horse. He took his hat off. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "my brother told me yesterday that he'd cut off your credit at the store, and I want you to know, I told him that was a damn fool thing to do, and I'm not proud of the Hartley name being used that way." Eleanor stood in her yard and looked at him. "Mr. Hartley, I had a note with Margaret Caldwell's company," he said, "from 1881. Small one for some equipment. I paid it off in full the following year. Or I thought I did." He reached into his coat and produced a paper. "Last month she sent me a notice saying I still owed $12 on the interest, which is not what the agreement said. I let it go because $12 wasn't worth a fight. But after I heard what you've done..." He held the paper out to her. "I kept the original note. The interest terms are written clear as anything. I don't owe her $12. She made up $12. Eleanor took the paper. $12. Margaret Caldwell had manufactured a $12 debt for a man who didn't owe it, which meant she was doing it not only for the big prizes, the farms, the land, the foreclosures, but reflexively, habitually to everyone in every amount, because it had worked so many times that she had stopped thinking of it as theft and started thinking of it as just how business was done. "Mr. Hartley," Eleanor said, "would you be willing to bring that original note and her recent letter to the circuit court hearing?" "I came here to ask how," he said. By Saturday evening, Gideon Cross had been informed of 6 additional families with documentation of similar discrepancies. None of them were farmers facing foreclosure. They were a blacksmith, a school teacher, a retired postmaster, a widow who ran a small boarding house, and George Hartley. They were the ordinary texture of a county town, the people Margaret Caldwell had been quietly skimming from for years, beneath the level that anyone would bother to fight. And none of them knew the others existed until Eleanor's letter to the Gazette made it safe enough to say it out loud. Thomas laid out all 6 new sets of documents on the kitchen table. Saturday night, and he and Eleanor sorted them by type by date, by the specific mechanism of fraud involved, and he passed them to her in order, and she organized them, and neither of them talked much because the work was the conversation. When they finished, it was late. The lamp was burning low. Thomas sat back and looked at the organized piles. "She's been doing this for 30 years, he said. "At least," Eleanor said. "How does a person do something like this for 30 years and sleep at night?" "I think," Eleanor considered, "I think you tell yourself a story, that everyone does it, that these people couldn't have survived anyway, that the land or the money is going to a better use in your hands." She looked at the documents. "And the longer you tell the story, the more you believe it. And by the time anyone challenges you, you've completely forgotten that it ever was a story." Thomas looked at her. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've had a long time to think about why people decide some lives matter less than others," Eleanor said simply. "It's a thing you study when you're on the receiving end of it your whole life." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas put his hand on the table. Not on her hand, just on the table 6 inches from hers, which was the most careful thing she had ever seen a person do, and somehow the most significant. "You matter," he said. "For what it's worth. From me." She looked at his hand on the table. She looked at her own. The 6 inches between them felt enormous, and also somehow already closed. "I know," she said. And then, before she could think better of it, "I think that might be why this has been so hard." He looked at her. "Because it's easier," she said slowly, like she was finding the words as she went, "to fight for something when you've already made peace with losing it. I'd made peace with this ranch. I'd made peace with being alone. And then you walked through the gate and started—" She stopped. "Making it harder to make peace with things." Thomas was very still. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't." She pulled her hand into her lap. "Not tonight. Tonight I need to be able to think clearly." He nodded, slowly. "All right. But—" She stopped again, made herself continue. "Don't think I haven't noticed." He held her gaze for a moment. "I haven't been subtle," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "You haven't." They stayed like that for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, and significantly shorter than either of them wanted. Then Eleanor stood and gathered the documents into their organized piles and said, "Circuit judge arrives in 3 days. I need to sleep." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was what he always said when he was giving her room that he didn't want to give. She was at the kitchen doorway when he said, "Eleanor." She stopped. "Whatever happens Tuesday," he said. "Whatever the judge decides. You did this. You found the documents and wrote the letters and went to Billings and brought the families together. That's yours. Whatever comes after, that's yours." She stood in the doorway with her back to him. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for more than Tuesday. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Sunday came, and with it the question of what Pastor Renner had decided. Eleanor sat in her usual pew. She had always sat in the same pew, third from the back on the left, since she was a girl with her father, and she was aware of the quality of attention in the room, the way you are aware of the direction of wind. People were watching, not openly. The specific sideways watching of a community that is waiting to see which way something is going to fall. Thomas had not come. She had not asked him to, and he had not offered, and both of them understood that there was a tactical logic to keeping him out of the church, while Sunday's content was still uncertain. It would have given Renner something too easy to gesture at. Pastor Renner delivered his sermon on the topic of false witness. He preached about the damage that untrue words did to communities. He preached about the responsibility of those with power to use it rightly. He preached about the difference between a person's reputation, which could be destroyed by a whisper, and a person's character, which could only be built or destroyed by the person themselves. He never said Eleanor's name. He never said Margaret's name. He did not need to. Eleanor sat in her pew and felt the room shift around her. Very slowly, the way a weather vane shifts when the wind changes direction. Each person adjusting individually privately, without announcement, but all in the same direction. After the service, 3 women Eleanor barely knew came and shook her hand. Ada Hollis was crying, which she denied vigorously when Eleanor pointed it out. Margaret Caldwell was not at the service. Eleanor drove home and sat on the porch and put her hands on her knees and let herself feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Not victory, it was too soon for that. But the particular sensation of a current changing. Of something that had been moving against her beginning slowly to move differently. Thomas came out and sat beside her without being asked. "How was it?" he said. "Better than I expected," she said. "Good." He looked out at the yard. "A letter came while you were at church, from Gideon Cross." She turned. He produced it from his shirt pocket. She opened it. Gideon Cross wrote to inform her that the Territorial Attorney General's office had formally opened an inquiry into Caldwell Holdings' lending practices across Harlow County. This was separate from and in addition to the circuit court hearing. The inquiry would likely take months to fully resolve, but its existence meant that any county court ruling in Margaret's favor would be subject to immediate review. More importantly, the Attorney General's letter to Margaret's lawyer had been sent Thursday afternoon. Margaret had known since Thursday, which meant every move Margaret had made since Thursday, the merchant boycott, the visit to the pastor, The tightening of every vice she had had been made in the full knowledge that the Attorney General was already watching. She wasn't operating from strength. She was operating from panic. Eleanor folded the letter. "She's scared," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. "Which makes her more dangerous, not less." He was right. They found out how much more dangerous on Monday morning when Eleanor went to the barn and found her barn door standing open. She had latched it the night before. She was certain of it. It was the last thing she did every night, check the barn latch, because her father had drilled it into her from childhood. The door was not forced. The latch had been lifted cleanly from outside, which meant it had been done by a person with a hand small enough to reach through the gap in the boards on the left side, which Eleanor had meant to repair and had not gotten to. Nothing inside was missing. Nothing was obviously damaged. But her 3 horses were in the wrong stalls. It was the kind of thing designed to make a person doubt themselves. Small, strange, deniable. Had she perhaps gotten confused putting them away last night? She was tired after all. She was under pressure. Perhaps she had simply put them in the wrong places. Eleanor stood in the barn and looked at those horses in their wrong stalls and felt the cold clarity of someone who has just understood exactly what is being done to them and why. Thomas appeared in his barn doorway. She pointed at the horses. He looked. He understood immediately. "She's trying to rattle you," he said. "I know." "Right before the hearing." "I know." Eleanor moved the horses back to their correct stalls with quick, deliberate movements. "It's also trespassing. It's also harassment of a party in an active circuit court proceeding." Thomas paused. "Can you prove it?" "No." She latched the last stall. "But I know what it is. And she knows I know." She turned around. "Fix that gap in the boards today. Top priority." "Already planning to," he said. He fixed it in 2 hours. Eleanor spent the rest of the day going through the documents, one final time, with the concentration of someone who was going to stand in front of a circuit judge tomorrow and could not afford to be surprised by anything. Gideon Cross arrived late Monday afternoon, driving a modest hired buggy and carrying a leather case that had clearly accompanied him through several decades of territorial courtrooms. He was the calmest person in the room, which was saying something because Thomas was also fairly calm. But Gideon Cross had the specific serenity of someone who had been in courtrooms his whole life and knew exactly how to manage the 24 hours before a significant hearing. He sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and went through everything one more time. "The key points," he said, "are simple. Original loan terms. No acceleration clause. Modified terms presented as transfer documents without borrower consent or signature. Aldous Price's sworn statement. The pattern of similar modifications across other accounts." He looked at Eleanor. "Margaret's lawyer will argue that the transfer document supersedes the original note, and that Eleanor's continued use of the property constitutes implied acceptance of the modified terms. And," Eleanor said, "and that argument has been rejected in territorial court in 1879 and 1882. I have both rulings." He sets them on the table. "Margaret Caldwell has a good lawyer. Her lawyer has a bad case. Those 2 things tend to cancel each other out." "What's her strongest move tomorrow?" Thomas asked. Cross looked at him with a slight expression of reassessment. The look of someone revising an earlier impression upward. "Her strongest move is to make Eleanor's personal character the issue rather than the documents. If she can convince the judge that Eleanor's actions, the letters the Attorney General, filing the coordinated testimony from other families, constitute a bad faith effort to obstruct a legitimate creditor, she shifts the hearing from a fraud case to a conduct case." "How does Eleanor guard against that?" Thomas asked. "By letting me do the talking," Cross said simply. "And by sitting very still and looking like exactly what she is, a woman who has done nothing wrong and is sitting in a courtroom to prove it." He looked at Eleanor. "Can you do that?" he asked. "I've been sitting still under people's judgment my entire life," Eleanor said. "I reckon I can manage one more morning." The circuit court convened in the Harlow County Meeting Hall at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and by 8:45 the room was full. Eleanor had not expected that. She had thought a few families, some officials, perhaps a reporter from the Gazette. She had not thought that half of Harlow County would show up to watch. But they were there. Farmers and merchants and women from the church auxiliary, and retired men who had nothing pressing to do, and young people who seemed to understand that something was happening that would matter. Calvin Patterson sat in the third row with his hat in his lap. Ruth Holloway sat beside him. George Hartley sat in the back with Mabel. Ada Hollis sat directly behind Eleanor's table, close enough that Eleanor could feel her presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. Thomas sat at Eleanor's right at the table. He was not her lawyer, but Gideon Cross had said that there was no rule preventing him from being there, and he was there, and that was that. Margaret Caldwell sat across the room with her lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Aldrich who had come from Billings specifically for this, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. He had a better suit than Gideon Cross. He had a newer leather case. He arranged his papers with the precise movements of a man performing competence for an audience. Cross arranged nothing. He already knew where everything was. Circuit Judge Emmett Harlan was a broad-shouldered man of 60 who had the face of someone who had heard every story and believed very few of them, and who sat down and looked at the room with the settled authority of someone who had not yet decided anything and was not going to be hurried toward a decision. He opened the hearing. Aldrich went first as the creditor's representative, and he was good. Eleanor gave him that. He laid out the transfer of the note, the terms as Caldwell Holdings understood them, the basis for the acceleration clause. He spoke with measured confidence, and he did not overreach, which told her he was experienced enough to know that overreaching in front of a circuit judge was the fastest way to lose. Then Gideon Cross stood up. He was 71 years old, and he moved slowly, and he had a slight tremor in his left hand that Eleanor had not noticed until right now, and none of that mattered at all, because when he spoke, the room went completely still. He laid out the original note. He laid out what it said and what it did not say. He presented Aldous Price's statement, and then he said, "Your Honor, I have also with your permission arranged for Mr. Price to be present today." A murmur went through the room. Eleanor had not known this. She turned and looked at the back of the room, and there was Aldous Price, white-haired and upright, sitting in the last row, with his hands folded in his lap. She turned back forward. Aldrich across the room had gone very still. Harlan looked at Price. He looked at Cross. "You're calling him?" "Only if the opposing party wishes to contest his written statement," Cross said. "If they accept it as accurate, we can proceed with the documentation alone." Harlan looked at Aldrich. Aldrich turned to Margaret and said something very quietly. Margaret said something back. Aldrich turned to the judge. "The creditor does not contest the substance of Mr. Price's statement." The room understood what that meant before the judge said anything. You could feel it, the particular quality of air that exists in the moment when a very long-running story arrives at its turn. Harlan nodded. He looked at the documents Cross had laid out. He read. He was not a man who rushed, and Eleanor sat very still and let him read, because she had learned somewhere in these last weeks that the hardest part of being brave was the waiting that came after. Harlan looked up. "The acceleration clause in the transfer documentation," he said in the specific tone of a circuit judge who has reached a conclusion, "does not appear in the original loan agreement signed by the borrower. The creditor has presented no evidence of borrower consent to the modified terms. The original terms of the note therefore remain operative." He paused. "The demand for immediate full payment has no legal basis under those original terms. The foreclosure proceeding is suspended." Eleanor heard the room breathe. She heard Calvin Patterson make a sound behind her that was not quite a word. She heard Ruth Holloway's chair scrape as the older woman leaned forward. She sat very still. Harlan continued. "Given the additional documentation presented regarding accounts held by other parties in this county, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for full inquiry. Caldwell Holdings is ordered to produce all original loan documentation for any note currently held from any borrower in Harlow County within 30 days. He looked at Margaret directly. "This court takes a very dim view of any evidence that original borrower agreements have been systematically modified without consent." Margaret Caldwell said nothing. Her face was a controlled and perfect mask, and behind the mask, Eleanor could see, because she had been looking at that face for 30 years and had learned to read what was underneath it, something that might in another person have been the beginning of fear. Aldrich was already gathering his papers. Harlan closed the hearing. And then the room began to move, and it moved toward Eleanor. Calvin Patterson was first. He put his hand out and she shook it, and he couldn't quite speak, so he just nodded, and she nodded back, and that was enough. Ruth Holloway hugged her, which Eleanor had not expected, and it was the kind of hug that came from a small, fierce woman who had spent 3 years with documents under her bed, and had just been told they were worth something after all. George Hartley shook her hand and said, $12, and they both understood every single thing that meant. Ada Hollis was crying again and again denied it. Gideon Cross said, well done, which from him was considerable, and Thomas was standing slightly to the side of all of it, not in the middle, not demanding anything, just present, watching her. With that open expression that she had seen only in unguarded moments, the one that was not careful or contained, but simply plainly honest. She crossed to him. She stopped in front of him. We won, she said. You won, he said. We, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was different, lower, slower, the way it got when he was saying something that mattered. There's something I've been meaning to say, since Billings, maybe before Billings. I know, she said. You know what I'm going to say. I have a reasonable idea, she said, which was almost word for word what he had said to her weeks ago about Margaret coming after her, and she saw him recognize it, and something in his face changed completely. Then maybe you should say it first, he said quietly, since you already know. The room was still full of people. People were still talking, still moving, still processing the morning's events. Nobody was paying attention to the two of them in the corner. Eleanor put her hands at her sides. She stood straight. She looked at Thomas Reed, this man who had walked through her gate with a torn jacket and a damaged hand, and had spent 2 months refusing to look at her the way the world looked at her. I think, she said carefully, that you might be the first person in my life who looked at everything this county told you about me and decided it was wrong. It was wrong, he said, and I think... She stopped, breathed. I think I'm not entirely sure what to do with that, because I've spent a very long time not expecting it. I know, he said gently. I know you have. But I think I'd like to figure it out, she said. If you're staying... Thomas looked at her. Then he said very simply, I'm staying. And Eleanor Whitaker, who had not cried in the circuit court, and had not cried in Price's kitchen, and had not cried when the judge read his decision. Eleanor Whitaker turned her face very slightly to the side for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back. Good, she said. The winter fence line needs work, and I can't do it alone. Thomas pressed his mouth together hard against something that was not a smile, or not only a smile. No, ma'am, he said. I reckon you can't. The winter fence line did need work. Thomas started on it the morning after the hearing, the same way he had started on the barn, systematically, without announcement, with the specific focus of a man who understood that the most important thing you could do after a significant event was return to the ordinary, and let the ordinary hold you while you found your footing again. Eleanor worked beside him. They didn't talk about what had been said in the courthouse. Not that morning, not that afternoon. There was an unspoken agreement between them that what had been said was real and would remain real without needing to be examined every hour, and that the fence needed mending, and that mending it together was its own kind of conversation. By noon, they had covered the north boundary. By late afternoon, they had started on the west. The cold had come down hard off the mountains, the kind of cold that meant business, and Eleanor's breath made small clouds in the air with every post she drove, and her hands ached in the way they always ached in October, and she was aware in a way she had not been aware before, or had not let herself be, of how close Thomas was working beside her. The particular rhythm of his movements, the way he read the fence line ahead without her having to describe it, the way he handed her things before she asked. She had always worked alone. She had told herself she preferred it. She was beginning to understand that what she had preferred was not being disappointed, which was not the same thing. That evening, Gideon Cross stopped by on his way back toward Billings. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and delivered the news plainly the way Eleanor had always appreciated. "The Attorney General's office will formally open the inquiry in the next 2 weeks," he said. "Margaret's lawyer has already been in contact requesting a settlement framework. That means they know the documentation is worse than what came out today." "How much worse?" Eleanor asked. "I suspect considerably. When an operation like hers has run unchecked for 30 years, the records tend to accumulate." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "She will not go to prison. I want to be honest with you about that. The standards for criminal conviction are high and her lawyer is excellent. But her ability to operate in this county, as she has been operating, that is finished." "The families who lost their land," Thomas said. "Patterson, Holloway. Restitution will be a part of any settlement negotiation. I will make that a condition." Cross looked at Eleanor. "I cannot promise how much or how soon, but I will fight for it." Eleanor nodded. "There's one more thing," Cross said, and his voice shifted into something slightly more careful. "Margaret Caldwell has retained additional counsel. She is exploring whether to file a counterclaim against you personally for defamation, specifically regarding the statements in your letter to the Gazette." The kitchen went quiet. "Can she win that?" Eleanor said. "No. Every statement in your letter was documented fact. Defamation requires false statement. She has no case." He paused. "But she can make it costly and slow and unpleasant. She can make it the kind of thing that takes 2 years and a great deal of energy to defend." He met Eleanor's eyes. "She is hoping you will accept a settlement. She drops the counterclaim, you drop the Attorney General filing." "She wants me to call off the inquiry," Eleanor said, "in exchange for clearing your debt entirely. No payment, no foreclosure, the note released." Thomas went still. Eleanor put both hands flat on the table. This was the moment. She could feel the shape of it, the particular weight of a decision that would determine not just her own life, but the lives of every family in Harlow County who had been waiting to see what the inquiry might uncover. Release the inquiry, save the ranch with certainty, and Margaret Caldwell would rebuild quietly over the next decade and do it all again to the next generation of farmers. Or hold the line and face 2 more years of legal fight with a man who was not yet her husband, but who was staying, and a ranch that was hers, but only just and no guarantee of how it ended. She looked at Thomas. He looked back at her and said nothing, because he understood absolutely that this was not his decision. She looked at Cross. "What would the inquiry likely produce?" she asked. "Based on what I've seen, evidence of systematic fraud across at minimum 12 accounts over 15 years. Possibly more. The kind of evidence that doesn't just discipline one operator, it changes how territorial courts look at private note transfers for a generation. And if I take her settlement, she survives, reduced quieter, but she or someone like her rebuilds." Cross looked at her directly. "I'm not telling you what to do, Eleanor. Your ranch is real. Your security matters. There is no shame in choosing it." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Calvin Patterson's face when he'd said, "I did a late thing." She thought about Ruth Holloway, with her box of documents kept under a bed for 3 years, waiting for someone to tell her they were worth something. She thought about Samuel Greer riding hard in the morning with his hat in his hands and his voice breaking over a father who had died believing he'd failed his family. She thought about a 14-year-old girl who had gone to the bank with her father and asked better questions than the adults. "Tell her no," Eleanor said. Cross looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost pride, the kind of pride that a person earns rather than receives. "I'll send the letter tomorrow," he said. He finished his coffee. He shook Thomas's hand. He held Eleanor's for a moment longer than a handshake required and said, "Your father would have done exactly the same thing." Then he left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment after the sound of his buggy faded. Thomas said, "That was either the bravest thing you've ever done or the second bravest." "What's the first?" Eleanor said. "Staying on that ranch alone for 2 years," he said, "before I got here." She looked at him. "I'm going to need you to understand something," she said. "What I just did, turning down that settlement that is going to make the next year very hard, possibly longer. There will be legal costs. There will be continued pressure from her side. The inquiry is not a guarantee of anything. I understand that. And I need you to know that when I say I want you to stay, I'm not asking you to stay because it's easy. It isn't going to be easy. Thomas looked at her with that open, unguarded expression. Eleanor, he said, I came here with a torn jacket and 40 cents and a hand that 3/4 of this county decided made me useless. I am not here because it's easy. I have never once in my life been in a situation that was easy. He leaned forward very slightly. I am here because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met in my life, and because when I watch you fight for something, I would rather be standing next to you than anywhere else on earth. Eleanor looked at him. She did not look away. Thomas Reed, she said. Yes, ma'am. I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. Always. She took a breath. Is the only job left on this ranch still husband? The question came out exactly as she had said it the first morning, standing in the yard with the bank letter crumpled in her pocket and this worn-down stranger asking about work. She had meant it then as a dismissal, a door slammed before anyone could try the knob. She did not mean it that way now. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Something happened in a kind of opening, a kind of arriving. The expression of a man who has been traveling towards something for a long time and has just understood that he is there. If that job's still available, he said quietly, I'd like to apply. Eleanor held his gaze. References, she said. One retired banker who'll vouch for my honesty. A pause. One circuit judge who's seen me under pressure. One very small, fierce woman named Ruth Holloway, who told me last week that you deserved better than this county had given you, and that whoever stood by you through this was a man worth knowing. He paused again. And about 2 months of fence lines and barn beams and wagon roads in the dark. Eleanor pressed her mouth together. Your hand, she said. Still damaged. I know. I'm asking if it bothers you. The work here, it's going to be hard on it. It's been hard on it since I arrived. He looked at his right hand. Hasn't stopped me yet. No, she said. It hasn't. She stood up from the table. Thomas stood up across from her. They were on opposite sides of a kitchen table that had held her father's accounts and her debt letters and Margaret Caldwell's fraudulent documents and Aldous Price's signed statement. And now in this moment, something that had been building since a stranger had told her the beam was cracked in 2 places she hadn't reached yet. Eleanor walked around the table. She stopped in front of him. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. She had spent 36 years being told that her size was the most important thing about her, the thing that overrode everything else, her capability, her intelligence, her courage, her worth. She had spent 36 years managing the way people looked at her, preparing herself for the flinch, the step back, the eyes that slid away. Thomas looked at her the way he had always looked at her. Like she was exactly who she was, and who she was exactly right. She put her hand on his chest. Just her hand. Just for a moment. He covered it with his left hand. We should probably tell someone, he said. Ada Hollis already knows, Eleanor said. She's known since the barn. He almost smiled. Does she know before or after you did? Considerably before, Eleanor admitted. He did smile then fully, and it changed his face, entirely. Took years off. It took the weight off it, left something underneath that was younger and warmer than the man who had walked through her gate. She had not seen him smile like that before. She intended to see it a great deal more. They told no one formally. They didn't need to. In a town the size of Harlow, a thing becomes known through a kind of atmospheric understanding, the way a shift in weather is felt before it's visible. By the following Sunday, the pew beside Eleanor's was occupied, and nobody commented on it because nobody needed to, and Ada Hollis sat directly behind them both and did not cry, which was frankly suspicious. The proposal itself happened on a Thursday, not a dramatic Thursday. A working Thursday, late November. Cold enough that their breath fogged in the barn while they were checking the cattle ordinary work, the kind that formed the actual texture of a life on a frontier ranch. Thomas stopped what he was doing. He looked at her across the back of a disagreeable steer who had been making both their mornings difficult. Eleanor, he said, Not now, she said, recognizing something in his tone. This steer is being a problem. The steer can wait. The steer cannot. Eleanor May Whitaker. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. I am asking you to marry me. She stopped. The steer, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, also stopped being a problem for a moment. In the barn, she said. I was going to wait for a better moment, and I've decided there isn't one, Thomas said. Because every moment with you is a working moment, and I don't want to ask you somewhere separate from the life we actually live. This. He gestured at the barn, at the cattle, at the cold, at all of it. This is what I'm asking to be part of. Not a Sunday version of it. The real version. Eleanor looked at him across the back of a steer in a cold Montana barn. She thought about the first morning. The beam cracked in two places she hadn't reached. The way he hadn't laughed at her. The way he had handed her things before she asked, and said nothing about the things she couldn't say yet, and cooked supper while she walked 8 miles to speak to a pastor, and waited at the gate because he needed to know she had made it back. Yes, she said. Just yes. No qualifications, no conditions, no walls. The steer resumed being a problem almost immediately, which was somehow the most appropriate possible end to that moment, and both of them started dealing with it. And Thomas was grinning in a way that made him look entirely undignified and entirely happy. And Eleanor found that she was grinning too, which was also undignified, and also she was discovering one of the best feelings she had ever had. They married in December, before the heaviest snow. Pastor Renner performed the ceremony in the church, which had the particular quality of warmth that a building gets when it is full of people who are genuinely glad to be there. Calvin Patterson attended and sat in the third row and wiped his eyes without apology. Ruth Holloway wore her best dress and said she had known it since the courthouse. Ada Hollis organized the reception with the energy of a woman who had been waiting for this specific occasion for some time. Gideon Cross came from Billings. He shook Thomas's hand and said, "Take care of her." Thomas said, "She takes care of herself. I'm just here to keep up." Cross looked at Eleanor and said, "I like him." And Eleanor said, "I know. I liked him first." Aldous Price sent a letter which Eleanor read aloud to Thomas that evening, which said simply, "Your father would have shaken his hand." That was the moment she cried. Finally, fully without apology. Thomas let her. He did not try to stop it, or manage it, or offer her an easier version of the feeling. He sat beside her and put his arm around her and let her feel what she felt for as long as she needed to feel it. Which was also so she understood what love was. Not the rescue version of it. The real version. The Attorney General's inquiry concluded in February. It was not everything. Gideon Cross had been honest about that from the beginning, and he was honest about it at the end. Margaret Caldwell did not go to prison. Her lawyer was too good, and the evidentiary standards were too high, and 30 years of careful operation had left enough deniability in enough places that criminal charges did not survive the full legal process. But Caldwell Holdings was dissolved by order of the territorial court. Every outstanding note held by the company was voided. Every family currently in active foreclosure proceedings was released. Every debt that could be traced to a modified original agreement. 12 families in total, more than Eleanor had known, more than even Cross had initially estimated, was cleared. The Patterson land came back to Calvin's family at assessed value, with a payment plan arranged through the newly reformed Garrison Territorial Bank, whose board had been thoroughly restructured following the inquiry. The Holloway family received a formal settlement. Ruth Holloway put the money in a bank account and took 3 days to cry privately before she started making plans. Margaret Caldwell moved to Billings. She sold her supply store to Jim Hartley, who sold it to his brother George, who operated it with a fairness and decency that made it for the first time in 40 years simply a store. The county clerk quietly resigned. A new one was appointed. And in the spring, when the Montana winter finally gave way, and the grass came back in the lower fields, and the mountains turned colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were, Eleanor and Thomas Whitaker rode the full perimeter of the 200 acres together. It took most of the day. They didn't talk for stretches of it. They didn't need to. They moved through the land that Robert Whitaker had spent 30 years building, and that Eleanor had spent 2 years holding, and that Thomas had spent the better part of a year helping to save, and they let it be what it was, theirs real permanent earned. At the north boundary where the creek bent and the 3 fallen pines had given them the timber for the barn roof, Thomas stopped his horse. He looked at the tree line. He looked at Eleanor. "Next year," he said, "this section could support another 20 head if we clear the east field." "I was thinking 25, Eleanor said. He looked at her. "The soil's better on the east side," she said. "I've been watching it for 3 years. Better drainage, better grass retention after a dry spell. 25 is conservative." Thomas looked at the field in question. 25, he agreed. She nodded. They rode on. There were hard years after that. That was the honest truth of a frontier ranch, and Eleanor had never believed in telling anything but honest truth. There were seasons where the weather turned wrong, and the yields were low, and the cattle were difficult. There were years where the money was tight enough that Eleanor went through the accounts 3 times, looking for anything she might have missed. There were arguments between her and Thomas, real ones, the kind that came from 2 stubborn people living a hard life in close proximity and caring deeply about how things were done. But there was always supper. There was always the other person at the other end of the table. There was always the particular comfort of being known completely by another human being, not the version of yourself you showed the world, but the actual version, the complicated and imperfect and sometimes frightened version, and being chosen anyway. In the summer of 1890, the Whitaker Ranch was selected by the Montana Agricultural Association as one of the 10 most productive operations in the territory. Eleanor received the letter on a Tuesday. She read it at the kitchen table. She called Thomas in from the yard. He read it. He set it down. "Huh," he said. "Huh," she said. "I thought we'd get it last year," he said. "The east field finally producing right, and the new barn structure." "Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am. We just got recognized as one of the best ranches in Montana." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm not surprised." She stared at him. He picked up the letter and read it again with a small private expression that she knew very well by now, the one that meant he was genuinely deeply pleased about something and was choosing to underplay it because he thought that was funnier than reacting the way anyone else would react. She took the letter out of his hands. She kissed him. I was still smiling when she pulled back. "Also," he said, "the east field. I should have listened to you about 25 the first time." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "Noted for future reference." 5 years of future reference, she said. "I've been noting it for 5 years, he said. "I note it every time I count the herd." People in Harlow County told the story of Eleanor Whitaker for a long time after. They told it differently, depending on who was telling it, and when some versions emphasized the legal fight, some emphasized the barn, some told by older women to younger ones, emphasized something quieter and harder to name. The way a person could spend a lifetime being told who they were and what they were worth and still find at 36 in a broken barn on a cold Montana morning that the story wasn't finished. Ruth Holloway told the story at her granddaughter's wedding in 1897, and what she said was this: "Eleanor Whitaker taught me that waiting for someone to see your value is a waste of the only life you have. You live as if you are worth seeing, and eventually the right person looks." Calvin Patterson told it to his son when the boy turned 21, and what he said was, "There was a woman on the next property over who saved our family. Not by being powerful, by refusing to stay quiet." Ada Hollis told it the way she told everything, with full emotional investment and considerable embellishment, and a core of absolute truth at the center. And the version she told was the one that spread the furthest and lasted the longest, and got closer probably to what the thing had actually been than any of the others. She said, there was a woman everyone had given up on, including herself, and a man who showed up at exactly the wrong time, which turned out to be exactly the right time. And neither of them was whole, and neither of them was easy, and the life they built was the hardest kind, the kind you have to build with your own hands every single day. But it was real, and it was theirs. And at the end of every hard day, there was another person who knew the full truth of who you were and had chosen you anyway. Ada said that was the whole story. She was right. On a January morning in 1892, with the snow heavy on the mountains, and the cattle settled in the rebuilt barn, and the accounts balanced, and the east field resting under a clean white cover that promised good things in the spring, Thomas came in from the early feeding and found Eleanor at her father's desk, writing in the account ledger, the same ledger Robert Whitaker had kept for 30 years, the same handwriting style, the same deliberate columns, the same care. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She looked up. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He stopped. "I just wanted to see you." She looked at him for a moment. "You see me every day," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the part I like." Eleanor Whitaker, who had spent 36 years being told she was not enough and had refused to believe it and had been right to refuse it, looked at her husband standing in the doorway of her father's house on a January morning in Montana, and she felt the full weight and rightness of a life that had taken everything she had to build. She turned back to the ledger. "Close the door," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He closed the door. He sat down across from her, and they went on, because going on was what they did, what they had always done, what they would always do. Two imperfect and stubborn and genuine people in a real life that asked everything of them and gave back everything that mattered. That was the ranch. That was the marriage. That was the story. And it was more than enough.